Mr. Sharma.
My lady, the next witness is Jonathan Marin.
Solemnly, sincerely and truly.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
Declare and affirm.
declare and affirm
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
I hope you were warned we might not get to you till this afternoon.
I was.
Mr. Marin, could we start, please, with you confirming your full name?
I am Jonathan Marin.
Mr. Marin, you have provided 4 witness statements to the inquiry. I'd be grateful if you'd confirm that they're true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
They are true to the best of my knowledge and belief. Yes, I confirm.
Prior to the pandemic, you were the Director General in DHSC for Prevention, Community and Social Care,
That is correct.
and your involvement in PPE commenced on the 18th of March of 2020, when you took on PPE responsibility at the Reasonable Worst Case Scenario Oversight Board. Is that correct?
Yes, broadly. So at that board, a set of things were discussed. There were a couple of particular actions relating to PHE and the governance of the PIP stock. I took those actions away to resolve. That was the start of my involvement in PPE. Over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks, I became more and more involved and eventually became the DG responsible for PPE in the Department of Health and Social Care.
And DG means Director
Oh,
General.
sorry, Director General. My apologies.
I'd like to start, please, with the stockpile, if we may. Could we have up on the screen INQ 000528391. This is a table, Mr. Marin, which is taken from your witness statement. This is the amount of PPE within the PIP stockpile as of the 3rd of October of 2019. You can see down on the left-hand side the product type, and then across the top the PIP stockpile target volumes, the PIP quantity, the percentage of the PIP target volume, and then what's called the JIC-JIT split. Would you help us, please, Mr. Marin, with what the figures in the second to last column and then the final column say?
I can. If you don't mind, may I just take one moment just to add my condolences to all of the people who were affected by COVID, and indeed to thank all of the workers on the front line who did so much to keep us safe during that period. Our thoughts for all of this work that my team and others were doing were really with the people on the front line, those who were affected. I would just like to say that before I start, and then we'll turn to the question.
Of course.
Apologies. So I think the columns you're asking me for are the last two. So the first one, entitled Percentage of PIP Target Volume. So PIP is the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Programme. So essentially this is the stockpile that the government held in case of a pandemic, an influenza pandemic in the basis of our planning. What the number then tells you is of the target volume, how much we thought we should hold against pandemic influenza, we actually held, and this is of the 3rd of October 2019. So as you can see, there is some of them we are at target volume or indeed over, but in some cases there's significantly less stock than the target volume. This comes around of the stockpile was originally created in 2009 in response to swine flu, and it was on a rolling programme of updation. So there were a set of contracts that would have delivered in 2020 that would have brought some of these under target areas.
I wonder if, sorry to interrupt, I wonder if you would slow down a little for the benefit of the transcript.
My apologies. So the areas that are below target, significantly less than 100%, in many of those cases, there were contract processes in place to buy more stock that would have seen the stockpile brought back up to target over the course of 2020.
But as at the 3rd of October 2019, it's right, isn't it, that there are significant deficiencies in the stockpile in respect of aprons, which is at 21.9%, and gloves, which is at 24.4%, and then at gowns and clinical waste bags, it was at 0%.
Yes, and that is all correct. Can I mention gowns? Because I think gowns is a particular case.
Of course.
So from the 2009 decision to keep it, gowns were not part of the stockpile. I believe in July of 2019, NERVTAG, the expert advisory body, advised that gowns should be part of the stockpile. This was agreed in the Clinical Account Measures Board in October of 2019, and the procurement was underway.
The Clinical Account Measures Board is what, please?
The board that oversaw the management of the PIP stockpile. So it was accepted that gowns should be added, and the plan was in place to procure gowns for the stockpile. That procurement was underway, but was not complete by the time the COVID pandemic hit the UK.
I think that is perhaps now the infamous procurement contract that took 9 months to fulfil.
Well, the procurement contract in this case was not fulfilled at all. It was the intention was to procure gowns using our normal procedure, which would indeed take between 9 and 12 months. That is a normal amount of time to do the market analysis and then run the full competition. Remember, of course, that was a contract not to meet an emergency requirement, but a normal process of replenishing a stockpile when we made the first decision.
And the final column, please, those 3 letters, JIC and JIT split. What is JIC and JIT, please?
So JIC is just in case, and what it essentially means is we actually held the product in a warehouse in the UK, in Haydock, as it happens. JIT is just in time. Here, we had entered into a contract with the supplier who would then deliver the materials in the contract in the event of them required for a pandemic. So the idea being that we would reduce the holdings in the UK and, of course, reduce the costs, both of storage and, indeed, these products have a shelf life. So after a particular period of time, they need to be replaced. So it was an attempt to have a more efficient way of holding stock. I'm sure we may come to it later, but I think we all now know that the just-in-time contracts did not actually deliver in the COVID pandemic.
And on those just-in-time contracts, it's right that none of them delivered, did they?
No, I believe none of them delivered.
That's the position on the 3rd of October 2019. I wonder if I could fast forward, please, to the 28th of July 2021. And could we display, please, INQ 000534966 and page 8. And Mr. Marin, if I can draw your attention, please, to the figure which is highlighted in red at the bottom of table 1. This is a snapshot of volume and value excess stock from the 7th of June 2021. And so after the pandemic, the figure here is excess stock plus do not supply stock sits at 6.9 billion units. I wonder if we could zoom out from that for a moment. And looking down, please, at paragraph 3, it says this: the PPE network in the UK is currently storing 1.3 million pallets of PPE. This costs DHSC in the region of £300 million per year in operational costs, of which £120 million is attributable to excess stock. At current pandemic usage, we estimate that £3.8 billion of stock will expire before it can be used. And so the position prior to the pandemic was that we didn't have enough PPE in the stockpile. And the position following the pandemic or in the later stages of it was that there was too much. Do you agree with that?
I certainly agree that the pandemic, the PIP stockpile was not to its target volume. And I think actually we may have a discussion about the target volume. Whilst I think based on reasonable assumptions at the time, our experience of COVID was that significantly higher volumes are required. And indeed, our current holdings against a future pandemic are at a higher level than the PIP stock. So I think on that. And it is also, I think, the case that our procurement of PPE during the pandemic led to having significant excess stock. Again, I think we procured on the basis of our best understanding of the model demand for PPE. The experience of the pandemic is we did not use all of that stock. So yes, these numbers are all correct.
Could we have a look, please, at a table which is in your witness statement, 528391, on page 231 and 232. Mr. Maron, this is the value of contracts that had been entered into that had technical and quality issues, or the documents for the contract were incorrect or incomplete. I wonder if you could help me, please, with the figures in this schedule.
If you would like me to walk through.
Yes, please.
So obviously at the top it starts with the number of contracts that we reported contractual performance issues. I think I should explain how we did this. Essentially, we should go back. We were procuring in a pandemic scenario. The normal checking of your product in advance simply wasn't possible. So whilst we were taking documentation and other forms of evidence from the manufacturers to suppliers, until we actually had the stock in our own hands in the UK, it was largely unable to do a proper quality check. So we were therefore cautious at what arrived in the UK. We were...
Slow down, please.
My apologies. If you keep reminding me, it will help. So we were very cautious on the materials that arrived in the UK because we wanted to ensure that we only sent stock to the front line that actually met the quality standards. So anything that arrived that we had any doubts about was put aside into what we call do not supply, essentially a holding category for us to come back to and check that. So these 176 contracts are essentially everything that went into do not supply. And then as we walk down the table, we explain, why they went in there and what happened. So the first block, number of contracts reviewed and found to be fit for purpose. So 19 of that first 176, these were actually fine. The stock had arrived, the documentation was fine. We had, our first check, we'd been nervous, but we showed ourselves.
Slow down, please.
Thank you. The next block, so that's the 400 million. Next block, value of products designated to be safe to be used following receipt of new documentation. Essentially, the product arrived in the country. We were nervous about the documents. We went back to the manufacturers or the wholesalers. They then provided documents that met our requirements, and these could be released. So then this is another 500 million of the total that actually these were good. The next block, again, so here, the product was delivered according to the contract standards. So it is what we bought. It was. However, we bought some things that the NHS doesn't like to use, of which I think the easiest to explain is aprons. So if you go into any NHS hospital, you'll find that aprons are on a roll, essentially, and they get pulled off. In the pandemic, we found that quite hard to buy at times, and so we also bought aprons in a box. So lots of these things are things like the aprons in a box that simply the NHS didn't use, and as the other stock was available to it, it chose that instead. So again, the contract is fine, but the product doesn't get used for that reason. Should we go to the next one? Next block. By the time we've got to this product, it's expired. So again, if we'd used it immediately, it would have been okay. But by the time it's checked, it's not. It's beyond its useful date. And then I think then we start getting into the things where actually there were significant issues with what we've bought. The first block here, value of product delivered to contract but could not be used. We have bought a product that does not meet the standards that are in place in the UK.
So to pick it up from there, so at that point, looking at the the box ahead of that, the product has been delivered according to the contract, but it's expired before use. And so that's £322 million which has been spent on items which can't be used. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then if we keep following it down, another 125 million where the contract has been met, but it can't be used. Is that right?
Yes. And if I could give an example of what might be in there.
Just allow me for a moment. And then in the final box, contract not met, and then the value of the claims have been waived or abandoned. What does that mean?
This is the total value where we have. I believe this is the total value where the contract has not performed, and we have accepted that we will not recover that amount of the value of the contract.
All right. So if I add up those figures, the ones I've pointed out to you, at those rows, I end up, I think, with about £1.2 billion. Is that right?
Sorry, can I check which rows you've added up?
Yes. So the rows 707 million at the bottom,
Yes.
125 million,
Yes.
and then 322 million.
Yes.
And I'm going to take the figure that we had on the document you saw a moment ago, 3.8 billion, and then 1.2 billion. The total that we have from those two documents of stock that can't be used is approximately £5 billion, isn't it?
I think the document you showed me before will include these numbers.
Right.
If we were to go back to it, I would have a better view and could say.
So the £3.8 billion figure you think includes these figures here?
Yes, because I believe it said it was do not supply stock and others, and this would all have been in do not supply. So I think it's included.
Well, the figure that we have spent on PPE, both by DHSC and SCCL, was 13.8 billion.
That is correct.
And the figure from the previous document was 3.8 billion. Yes, so approximately a quarter of the stock that was purchased, both by DHSC and SCCL together, couldn't be used. Is that right?
Sorry, I'm trying to go back to the document you showed me previously. It was a snapshot in time, so I don't know how much of that was then used in the 2 years. So we've continued to provide free PPE to the NHS and social care through the period after the pandemic. So we may have used some of it, but so I don't have an exact number to confirm your position. I could certainly check. It is true there's a significant volume that has not been used. Definitely broadly, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. How do we get in the position of 320 odd million pounds worth of product that expires before you even get to use it? How does that happen?
So some of the products have relatively short shelf lives. And I think the key challenge is our modelling of what we thought we would use compared to what we actually used turns out to be very different. I think this is part of the challenge of actually the modelling was actually a very complex and difficult task. There's no previous experience to rely on. We haven't had a pandemic, so it's not as if we could look back and say, what did we use in the past? What we had to do was essentially model a whole series of things, if I can walk through. So the first, of course, is understand the pandemic itself. So for that, we took the reasonable worst case scenario estimates that came out of SPIEM. So the same models that you'll see everybody else using. Of course, there was less COVID than those models, so they're already slightly over. The next challenge was to take, okay, if that's how much COVID we have, and if we take the professionally produced infection potential control guidance, which says when you should use PPE, can we convert the number of patients we think we'll have into the number of interactions in the health service and in social care? So that's a technical task in itself. So we modelled that with the help of external consultants. And then the third block is to actually just manage the normal use of these products. So if you think of the complete PPE ensemble, some of it is very rarely used in the NHS. So the FP3 respiratory mask, I mean, really only used in this sort of scenario. But some of it is immensely common. Gloves, aprons, used all of the time. When we were buying for the entire use. There wasn't an uninterrupted BAU supply chain and then an additional one for COVID. It was all interrupted. Our modelling, so the modelling for how many patients the NHS would see was based on NHS England's predictions of how much activity there'd be in the NHS. Again, that turned out to be, the predictions were slightly higher than the forecast. So I think as you go through the model, whilst I think we made reasonable assumptions at each stage, we ended up with a total demand that was higher than what we then saw. And I think the real comparison, if you're looking at what we've learned from this, if we look at the second or third waves of COVID, when really there's not a shortage of PPE, you know, we can provide to the whole of the healthcare system. I think that gives us the level that actual usage was.
Can I ask a question? In relation to the stockpile, let's call them PPE, I appreciate maybe more than just PPE, but do products go into the stockpile and stay there for an emergency, or do you draw down on the stockpile for normal usage?
So I think the PIP stockpile before the pandemic was largely held for emergency. Now, some things had been drawn down. So I think actually if you go back to some of the earlier evidence, and I believe aprons in particular, there'd been a BAU shortage and some had been released to help with that. But
Business as usual.
Sorry, I'm doing very badly on the acronyms. I will try and do better. Business as usual. So, but the PIP stockpile really used for out of the ordinary events. What we're trying to do now is have the stock rotated through, which certainly for something like gloves, even though you want very high volumes, because they're used at such high volumes, you can push them through the stockpile without them ever, you know, they won't ever reach their shelf life date. For other items, you know, the respirator masks particularly, there's such little usage of them that essentially you're going to have to hold them for a pandemic. You can look at shelf life extension at the end of their manufactured shelf life, but they will at some stage need to be replaced. So I think we are trying to think much more about what is it we can just flow through the system to get better value for everybody, and then what things actually there's no alternative other than to hold the stock just in case.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Maron, so we've covered what the stockpile looked like prior to the pandemic, and we've looked at some of the figures as they were following the pandemic. I want to turn with you, please, to what the situation looked like when you arrived and became the Director General in the PPE cell and took the lead for it. The inquiry has already heard in opening that chronology which follows the just-in-time contracts failing and the realisation that they had failed, and the movement from SCCL's confidence that there was going to be enough provided from those contracts to realising a short time later, I think a period of 9 days, that actually those contracts were going to fail and that the UK was going to be catastrophically short of PPE. So can you explain to the inquiry what the position was when you took your role and what were the challenges that you faced?
Yes, thank you. As you have outlined, at the point I became involved in PPE, and indeed many of the colleagues that then became the PPE cell we describe in our document, this came about as the government's response to understanding that our existing supply chain simply wasn't going to be able to deliver the volumes of either procurement of PPE we required, or indeed the distribution of that PPE to the front line. That whilst we'd had plans in place, we had a stockpile that we thought was going to be extraordinarily important, we needed more. And we needed more not in 4 to 6 weeks' time, but we needed more immediately. So I think the sense as we formed that cell is we were all absolutely aware of the position that we were in, that there were significant shortages of PPE at the end of March. We have already talked about gowns, which were an immediate problem. But also,
Pause for a moment. When you say significant shortages and that you became aware of them, how were you becoming aware of these shortages in PPE within DHSC?
well, can I talk through a day of how it made that result? If I think back to March, well, how would my day start? I would start, wake up at 6 in the morning. I'd start by logging on to the Cabinet Office dashboard, which told us the overarching PPE. So I would look at number of new cases, number of hospitalisations, and number of deaths. Excuse me. Which was an incredibly sobering start to the day.
Take your time, have some water if you prefer.
Thank you. I then travelled to work. I had the good fortune to be part of the command cell that was in the office. We were socially distanced, but we were there. I think that made it much, much easier and helped our resilience. We would start with an 8:30 meeting where we would go through where we are in the day. So what were the action we took yesterday? What do we know? What's our best intelligence of where supply and demand is? By this stage, we have brought together the PIP stockpile, the material that SCCL has. There was a Brexit stockpile as well, which is in the evidence. So that's now operating as one. We know what we've got. We're also looking on a daily basis at what we have ordered and its progress. And again, I think everybody understands that in this period, the global supply chain was significantly interrupted. Simply placing an order didn't guarantee that it then arrived on the date that it had been promised. So the tracking through, the making sure the logistics worked, that was a major part of our...
Slow down, please, Mr. Marin. Let me just ask you this question, please. In terms of what you've just described, making that first order, what exactly does that mean and what does that entail? So the supply chain has effectively collapsed. The just-in-time contracts have failed. And in DHSC, what is happening in order for you and other officials to try and procure PPE on a day-to-day basis?
So I think the existing supply chain is not going to deliver what we need. Roughly half of all of the products we bought were bought by SCCL. Indeed, their procurement team becomes the existing buy team in the PPE cell. So we didn't simply look for different solutions. We worked really hard on do our existing networks and our existing contracts work, and that's about half of the total volume. We have assembled in the Department of Health a team that raises up to about 450 people, essentially organised to try and do this work. There's a buy team drawn from the government commercial service, a core from, I think, the complex transaction teams. Andy Wood, I think, is a witness following me. He ran that team. And with the complex transaction making the core of that, we then had other commercial specialists from Whitehall to give us a new buying force. They spend their time looking at the offers that are coming through to us, trying to triage those, the ones that we think are credible, then being taken through a technical and commercial due diligence phase, which then allows a procurement. So the activity is assembling a team of volunteers with commercial experience, but not experience in buying PPE or healthcare, that can then start on the process of following up procurement leads that are coming in to the organisation and indeed starting on our own.
And this team is being drawn from across government, isn't it?
Yes.
It's not only officials from DHSC.
No.
There are people from the Ministry of Defence, for example, from the Cabinet Office and elsewhere. And they are coming together to form what I think is called the PPE cell. Is that right?
That is correct. And so, look, the sorts of people came, lots of people from the government commercial service, who maybe belonged to different departments but had commercial expertise. And then we drew on, the MOD had specific expertise in contract assurance, so their team came to help. And then alongside, if you like, that buy effort, we have a distribution and logistics effort, again with military support. SCCL's existing distribution stays in place to do everything but PPE and delivery to hospital. and we contract with Clipper through SCCL to provide additional logistics and distribution support, essentially a new warehouse.
Pause for a moment. So there's a PPE cell which is concentrating on procurement within DHSC.
The PPE cell as a whole,
Yes.
I've described as having a buy team doing procurement. And if you broke those down, existing buy, essentially SCCL continuing. China buy, working with the British Embassy in Beijing to really understand, can we get close to the Chinese manufacturers? That's a very successful route for us. A UK make team, which eventually manages to get, I think, about 25 contracts for manufactured PPE in the UK. And then the new opportunities team, which is really chasing down a whole range of potential routes and avenues to buy PPE.
We're going to come on to the new opportunities team in a moment. I wonder if we could have that, please.
Sorry, could I just do because that's buy. I think we've then got a logistics team that are doing two things. We're transporting goods from China back to the UK. Normally in this market, you buy your gowns or whatever else with transport. Transport was no longer available. You had
Mr.
to
Mayor,
order stuff.
pause for a moment. I just want to bring up a figure so that everyone
Yep.
can understand what you're talking about. I wonder if we can bring up Mr. Maron's witness statement, INQ 000528391. And page 205. Just over the page, please. If we can zoom into the top. This is an overview of the PPE supply chain, which you've been describing.
Yes.
On the left-hand side are the entities you've been describing, so DHSC Buy,
Yes.
UK Make, and SCCL. And then on the right-hand side of the diagram are all of the issues with distribution. And on top
Yes.
of that, you've described the fact that PPE at the same time is being flown in from China and from other countries to interlock with this diagram.
That's right.
But in terms of the DHSC operation, it's centred here, DHSC Buy. It's split into teams, and those teams are, forgive me, you're going to tell me something.
I was just saying, all of this is the DHSC operation.
Great.
So the PPE cell managed this entire process. And then the buy teams in the cell manage the procurement process.
What is established is something which is called the parallel supply chain,
Yes.
which we're going to look at. And the offers that were coming in to DHSC were organised, or they were triaged in something which is called the 8-stage process, which we're going to come on to. I wonder, please, if we could have another diagram up. Page 121. If we could zoom into the top. This is called the end-to-end process, Mr. Maron, a process which I think you'll be familiar with.
That's correct.
At number 1 is initial data triage. What's that, please?
So this is, I think, the first 3 steps on this process are really about understanding what's coming into the organisation, the basic information around the offer, what has been offered, what volumes, what times, then moving into, is that what we want and should we be prioritising it? And then, of course, the third one is contact. So this is, if you like, the initial triage phase of, does this look like a worthwhile offer for us to continue? And then the next stages, which are highlighted in orange in the diagram, are really the detailed stages of looking at, is this the right opportunity? So in financial and commercial due diligence, really looking at the organisation we're entering a deal with. Is this an appropriate vendor of PPE? Is it of sufficient financial status to take the weight of the contract? You know, do the commercials work? And then the technical review, really looking at, well, what is the product and does it meet our standards? And of course, this was a really important phase for us of really, are we buying PPE that meets the standards of the NHS?
as an offer is being progressed through this 8-stage process, does it have to complete one stage in order to progress to the next stage and then so on?
So it gets through the first 3 to be handed on to commercial and technical. They run in parallel. So if you like, there's a process, right? Is this a sensible offer for us to pursue? And if no, we can then stop without doing the detailed due diligence work. Once we think it's worth pursuing, then the due diligence can work on both technical and commercial. If they are both satisfied, it moves to the final stage of closing, where really we're looking at, well, now what is the deal on offer? Is the price within the range that we're prepared to pay? When is delivery? The normal things you would think of in closing a contract.
All right. I want to have a look, please, at what lies underneath this 8-stage process. Could we bring up, please, INQ 000551580? And page 14, please. This is the process flow, isn't it, that an offer comes into once it's received in DHSC.
Yes.
It has to follow each and every one of these procedural steps in order for it to move on to the next stage of the 8-stage process. Is that right?
This sets out in diagrammatic form the steps that a worker would go through. So there may be different routes in. So, for example, if you look at the very top, there's a contact via email, which then would take you to send the web form link back to the provider. Obviously, start 2, if the web form comes direct, then you don't need to do that step. So the way to think about it is you start at the start points and then follow the arrows through, and it takes you through what a caseworker would do in each case.
Could we turn over to the next page, please? The next page. This is a continuation, isn't it, of the same flowchart, but in this stage, it's at stages 3, 4 and 5, which are being demonstrated on here.
Yes.
And if we turn over the page again, please. This is a continuation, isn't it, of the 8-stage process. This is what's happening underneath what looks like an elegant system. 8 steps, it looks clean and simple, but in reality, what's happening beneath is something which is very complicated, isn't it?
I'm not sure I accept that these are very complicated. I mean, what we've done here is set out schematically all the steps somebody have to take. So I think you follow it. But look, for example, send rejection letter is a step here. I mean, I don't think that's a complicated thing, but it is what you must do to complete when you get to a no. So I would accept that if you're not familiar with these sort of diagrams, they look incredibly complicated. But I think actually for somebody who is working in a commercial team, this is a relatively comprehensive way of putting together the flow of what the work have to do. Now, that is not to say that the tasks were straightforward and easy. I mean, we were buying critical products for the protection of our health workers and our patients. And we have to do that in a way that was effective. So I think ensuring that we had the right technical specs, which at times was very difficult. I mean, again, if we just reflect on normally, we'd simply buy something with a CE mark. Where we could do that, great. But we were also buying from overseas manufacturers that hadn't supplied to Europe before, didn't have CE marks. And so we needed to check that their specifications were equivalent, get derivations from our regulators, and ensure that we could use those products. So it is a complicated thing to do. I would set that. I don't think we made an overly complicated process out of it.
Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000474996? These are infographics which have been prepared by the inquiry based on your witness statement, Mr. Maron. And in order to demonstrate at each stage the quantities of material in the context of the decision tree and the process charts that we've looked at. And I'm going to take you quickly through these. The first step, initial data collection. looking at those process charts and then putting them into the context of the numbers of offers which were being received, 24,000 is the approximate figure, across 50,000 categories of PPE from over 15,000 suppliers. All of that information is being fed in to that, what I would say is a very complicated and, dare I say, labyrinthine process flow that we just looked at. And the members of staff, the officials looking at those offers at the initial stage, would have been overwhelmed by that, would they not?
So I certainly think that we struggle to process all 24,000 offers. The steps that we were looking to do in these early phases were about trying to identify and triage the most likely offers to take forward. So it is not that 24,000 offers we attempted to put through all of the 8 steps. And indeed, the first 3 steps on the chart are really about, can we identify which of these offers were the most likely to be successful? I think if you're asking questions about could this have been done better, I'm sure that is true. And indeed, we've looked at this since the pandemic. The Boardman Review particularly looked at this. And I think some higher level of both automation and indeed a higher bar to get through this initial gate. So could we automatically filter out offers that didn't have particular volumes? I think that would have been a more effective process.
All right, we'll come on to automation in a moment. If I can take you, please, through this 8-stage process on here. Could we have a look at slide 2? The next step was identifying opportunities and triaging. That was itself accompanied by another set of guidance. And then there was a stage in which initial due diligence was conducted. Stage 3, please. Opportunities had to be validated, and that meant that what caseworkers were doing was they were contacting suppliers, they were having conversations with them, they were trying to get details of what was being offered, estimates of prices, lead times, researching the manufacturers, and then another set of guidance for them. Step 4, please. Commercial due diligence. Another team separate from the other, a due diligence form requesting a large amount of information. Company name, company number, registered address, some of which had already been collected at stage 1. So there's an element of duplication here, is there not?
Well, I think the descriptions that we set out in the witness statement looked at the things we're doing. Now, as you know, the process evolved over time. I don't think we asked people to redo the steps that had already been taken. But in thinking about commercial due diligence, this is what we expected to have. I don't think you can avoid looking at this information. In fact, I think we took a great deal of risk on commercial due diligence. You have to remember this is it's an emergency procurement. We are looking at companies that we haven't worked with before. Some of these companies, not established for very long. We needed to have a proper assessment of the risk we were taking. We took some contracts with firms that had a limited history of PPE, but it turns out from their business in China or other places had connections that did deliver PPE for us. So it was worth looking at these, can I say unconventional providers? Would that be an appropriate term? But it did mean that we had to do the due diligence. I think it would be very difficult to have placed contracts with public money without looking at these challenges. So I think the things that we were looking at were appropriate. I think on commercial due diligence particularly, we improved our process over time.
Forgive me, I'm not suggesting for a moment that DHSC did not consider some of this information. The question is as to how the information was being absorbed, how it was being looked at by DHSC, where it was being stored, what systems there were for managing large quantities of information which were being provided by potential suppliers within the context of a system that we've looked at with all of those flows and processes and questions. And at each stage of this process, it's right, isn't it, that the information wouldn't have come in one direction. This would have been a dialogue with, or potentially a dialogue with those suppliers. For example, if a piece of information were missing, then a caseworker would have to contact the company to get it, and this would be an ongoing conversation.
In terms of the storage of information, it's certainly true in the very early days of this programme, as we pulled together a team to do the emergency procurement. I think our first DHSE procurement is on the 22nd of March, I think, so very early in the process. The team were relying on really recording things on Excel spreadsheets, which we absolutely understood was not the way we should be doing this. By April, we moved to a tailor-made management system called Mendix, which the Cabinet Office team provided. So at that stage, all of this information is stored on Mendix. As we get to the end of this procurement phase and we move to a more regularised position, we then move on to the Department of Health's database, which is Atomis. And the Mendix information has been retrospectively moved over to Atomis. Again, I think some challenges with that process.
We'll come on to that. Can I move, please, on to step 4? The next stage in which the offer had to be processed was a technical review. Again, this team had another set of guidance to look at. They had to check certificates of compliance, test set data, a quality management system. They had to keep up in that bottom left-hand corner with the technical specifications which were changing. So again, a caseworker in this team here had another enormous set of information that they had to absorb, to triage, to manage and to look at. Is that right?
That is right. And I think having a technical phase where the people were dedicated to looking at this, I think helps. And part of this process is trying to break up those expertise. You have is this worth pursuing in those first 3 steps? You've got a set of commercial questions about is the risk of entering into a contract with this counterparty appropriate? And then you've got, actually, when we buy this PPE, is it going to be what we need? And frankly, that was more difficult. So lots of people were selling PPE that did not meet the standards and specifications. So doing this properly was absolutely critical to protecting frontline workers and indeed members of the public.
Where then were the bottlenecks in this system? If one part of this system had to be completed, if one step had to be completed before the next, then there were areas, were there not, in which there were bottlenecks in offers being processed. And so what this system was doing in part was doing what you suggest, which is making sure that public money was being spent properly. But what it was also doing was slowing down those offers because of bottlenecks which had been created as a result of the process.
We were certainly challenged on the capacity of the team and the speed we were going. I think we improved this over the course of the time. Indeed, you might come to the rapid review team that was established to try and really accelerate the highest, the offers that looked the most likely to give us significant results.
So forgive me, we'll come on to the rapid review team in a moment, but one of the reasons, was it not, for the creation of the rapid review team was in part to deal with this problem of the complexity of the 8-stage process, that what was happening was that good offers were getting stuck within the system. They needed to be picked up, they needed to be identified quickly, and they needed to be put through the 8-stage process. And so the rapid review team, when it was created in April, was there in order to deal with that problem. Is that right?
But they did the same things. So it wasn't that we dropped the stages of the process. We didn't put the rapid review team and not do due diligence or not do technical. It was a way of saying, can we do that in a different way that would be quicker? So I think this is the learning of how do we really drive through our most likely deals. And I again come to this whole process. We start from not having, this is an emergency procurement of PPE, the government stepping in because we know our existing channel isn't going to work. And we developed our processes whilst buying PPE. So I think there is definitely a sense of things improve over this time. And indeed, as we move to a regularised PPE model, we don't use this model. We move away to a category model rather than a steps in the process model. So,
why has it moved from the steps in a process model to a category model? Is it because that's more efficient?
We moved as we brought in the stabilised model for PPE was led by a set of external procurement experts. they thought it'd be more effective to move that model, and particularly to manage our understanding of what was required. So I think if you looked at a normal procurement model in the private sector, you're likely to see a category managed model. Here we got this, I think, largely in those opening weeks, because we absolutely needed to get going. And that ability to triage which offers we were taking and which ones looked most likely to provide the product we needed was important. And that allowed us to then only take the technical review and the commercial due diligence on those that looked likely, rather than having to do all of the work on all of the offers.
Had DHSC had any experience in creating systems like this before?
So I think this team was put together and its processes by the experts from the Government Commercial Service who came to do the buy-sell. So this wasn't designed by Department of Health civil servants. It was designed by the people who then went and ran the process.
Thank you. Can we move, please, on to step 6? At the stage here, closing terms, conditions and pricing. At this stage, there's another level of assurance.
I think the cost assurance analysis that's on the left of this diagram, that really is the commercial due diligence. In the very, very early weeks, the closing team were doing commercial due diligence. So that's why it features here. You've picked it up from that description of the early weeks. Obviously, once we had the step, I think, I remember it's 4 or 5, I always think of it the wrong way around. Once we had the commercial due diligence team in place, that's where this happened. So this is in the first few weeks, the closing team were looking at due diligence. We then established a properly staffed commercial due diligence team, and then this step was not then carried out at stage 6. This is it's either 4 or 5.
All right.
Get the technical and commercial work stuff.
Well, nonetheless, at this stage now, prices are being negotiated. The supplier, if it's in a foreign country, there has to be a liaison with the FCDO. Government legal advice has to be sought.
Yeah.
And at this stage, it's only at this stage that the offer is discussed in detail with the supplier. And so by the time the offer has reached this stage, it's already consumed a number of resources before it gets to stage 6.
I think the offer is discussed with the supplier in the very first stages.
All right.
So I think what we get to here is, at this stage, we are now confident that the supplier is somebody that we are prepared to do business with, which wasn't always the case. That the stock that they're offering meets our standards, which certainly was not always the case. And it's now into a closing part of the deal of what is the price that we're prepared to pay. So this really is closing the deal.
All right. Can we move to step 7? Now we're completing the approval documentation. And that results in an email being sent. We'll come on to the next step, to the AOs, the accounting officers. If you turn back to the preceding page, and there are the documents which have to be prepared: terms and conditions, the order form, the notice of advance payment, new supplier form, supplier letter, CAPA approval, technical documentation, the department's requisition form, and so on. And all of those are sent to an accounting officer, step 8, who then has to check all of those documents against the managing public money guidance. So starting off with where we were at the beginning, all of these offers are coming through the system. The numbers of accounting officers who have to then deal with the proposals to purchase only number 3, don't they? There's only 3 of them. And so is that another point, rather like technical assurance, of which there was a bottleneck?
No, I don't think we had a bottleneck at the accounting officer. I think by this stage, the 8-step process we've been through has provided the evidence on whether whether this is the product we need to buy, whether actually it is appropriate to go ahead with the counterparty, and whether it's technically efficient. Now, I think the accounting officer needs to know those things in order to authorise the spending of what was quite significant sums, well, no, not quite, very significant sums of public money. I do think having the accounting officer separate and signing off the appropriate deal gave us an extra layer of protection against deals that we shouldn't have been doing. And I think having that independent review at this stage is a helpful step.
Well, we'll be hearing from them in due course. Could I have up, please, an email which was sent by Mr. Hall, who is the interim government chief commercial officer, to Max Kerndorf, who is the head of the high priority lane. It's INQ 000534626. And this is what Mr. Hall is saying in the middle of the page. We've designed the least efficient process possible. Then his second comment is that the lag in the process and shipping is killing our demand signal. He makes a comment about competition and then makes a final comment about the fact that IT was killing us, he said. Do you have any observations to make about that, Mr. Marin?
Well, Chris is a highly experienced procurement expert, so I think we should take his comments very seriously. He was working in the team, and indeed I think Chris is instrumental in the rapid review team and trying to make sure that we are doing this properly. In one way, I'm really pleased to see that we were engaging in how we improved our processes. I mean, if you think about the time this process is only in place between the very end of March and I think probably the very end, beginning of June, beginning of July. So actually, wave one, that we spent each day looking at the newspapers of just how critically short of PPE we were. We spent each evening looking at our demand signal. You know, what we thought we used. We knew what was coming in. We would see the shipments we thought were coming in getting struck off our incoming list because they weren't turning up. And I think there was a great deal of concern about we should do all that we can to get the PPE that was needed. So I think that led to two things. We were prepared to look at a very, very wide range of offers, which I think was right. Our processes were, I think people use the expression designed in flight. I don't really like it, but it portrays we were trying to buy and design at the same time. We didn't have a month to think about how we do it and then start. And I think we did make improvements over those 3 months. And then as we got out of this period, we looked again at how we should manage our process. As it happens, we did very little procurement of PPE after we get to about June 2020. We simply have ordered enough. Our modelling suggested a rather larger level of demand. So I think beyond that time, we really only buy gloves, which obviously the NHS uses in vast quantities anyway, so that needs to be stocked up. We may have made some small purchases of masks, but I would need to confirm that.
The inquiry's heard about that 100 days, and as you say, you're quite right, that DHSE was trying to build a system whilst it was purchasing PPE at the same time. Had it ever been involved in such a design and creation of a process before? Was this the first time?
I think the Department of Health, as a corporate organisation, no, not at all. Whether the individuals that came to help us had been involved, I think many of the Cabinet Office and the government commercial service people would have been involved in commercial deals, how to procure, but whether I don't think would have been involved in something of this scale. Chris Hall may be a good witness to ask that question. Over this 100 days, we added a range of experts who could bring logistics skills, the management of these sort of procurement processes. But again, I think the scale of what we put together over a very short period of time, I think probably is unprecedented for a government department. We essentially doubled our procurement capacity versus the existing SCCL, and we went from a distribution capability, which I think was a few hundred hospitals, to being able to deliver to over 50,000 sites as we delivered PPE to every social care provider, every GP, every pharmacy in the land. So I think over this 100 days, there's an absolute transformation in our capability to both procure and distribute PPE. And indeed, I think if we look over the second and third waves of the pandemic, the sorts of difficulties we see on PPE in the first wave are not repeated. We've really managed to get a process in place that allows us to get the materials to the people who need them.
And nonetheless, noting what you say about buying quantities of PPE at speed as you describe, it remains the case, doesn't it, that the UK overbought by a significant quantity the PPE which it needed?
Yes, but I think we bought to both our target for what we believe demand was, which, as I have explained earlier, was a model that we put together during the pandemic, which I think also bears thought. I think, when you're doing these things, the model is based on assumptions. Whether we put conservative assumptions in at each stage because we were so worried about having the PPE we needed, I think that could be looked at. I think it's really difficult in the height of a pandemic when you can see the impact on the front line, on people in the country, to really think, oh, actually, no, we don't need to buy this. And I do remember we had conversations that something on the lines of, we are not going to get this right. It's just not possible to do. So we're either going to do one or two things. We're either going to underbuy, and we will get into the second wave, which we all knew was coming, and we'll have repeated scenes like we'd seen in March and April, and indeed into May and June. Or, if we take more cautious assumptions on demand, we will overbuy. And I think we were all convinced that actually, if that's the choice, then overbuying was better than underbuying. Now, I'm sure we could spend more time examining, the effectiveness of our model, what we should have in future, and being better prepared. And just on the future part of it, I do think that running through this experience and really seeing how PPE is used in the front line gives us a much, much better basis for understanding what stockpile should be and what we should buy in future than trying to work it out mathematically, which, whilst I think we did good modelling, that sort of modelling is very, very hard to do.
If I may, to draw upon your experience, if you were going to choose 1, 2 or 3 of the lessons which you learned from being the Director General in the PPE cell, and from seeing the system being designed and from seeing the pressures and the strains it was under, what would be those 3 key lessons that you would suggest ought to be learned about the system which was managing and triaging the offers that were coming in, and about the processing of information generated by those offers? You've mentioned automation. Is there anything else that you would suggest?
Well, I think the first thing, I think the biggest lesson is about our capability and resilience going into this sort of a crisis. I think lots of our difficulties came from the fact that we were an emergency response bolted on top of a system that hadn't been able to grow quick enough. So I think our real lesson...
Forgive me, what do you mean by that?
The existing procurement system in health and care was a company called SCCL, Supply Chain Coordination Limited, which talk about, and then the NHS itself procuring directly. As you described earlier in the hearing, when we got to March, we were clear that wasn't going to work. Now, if we had been in a position that we were able to scale that system more effectively, I think that would have been better. I think where we look at other countries' experience, where they were able to build on their existing systems, they found that easier to do than to build something brand new in flight. So I think my first thing, is a lesson, is that we really must look to the resilience of our existing procurement, and indeed SCCL are taking a range of steps to be in a better position. Not least their PPE procurement is now taken back in-house. SCCL contracted out much of their work to other organisations. PPE is now an in-house team, so they've got a core of expertise that's that. We're also working on much better data and visibility. I think SCCL have an inventory management pilot going so they can see frontline stocks. Not being able to see the stocks in the front line was a significant problem, I think, in the pandemic. Not for the amount we bought, but for the decisions we were making on a daily basis on which hospitals, which services got PPE. Knowing that actually they had some in stock would have made it easier to make sure you got to others. I think that's my first lesson. I think if we do get into this situation again, and let's hope we do not, and our systems are resilient enough, but if we need to move into this sort of broader net of catching offers, I do think that having a higher bar at the front of the system would be helpful.
What do you mean by that?
So that we basically allowed everybody to fill in a web form, and that included multinational corporations who absolutely could help us, and people with small business that might have had some work with China, but really was never going to be a credible offer. And I think our system required us to look at both of those in that first phase to triage out the ineffective ones. And I think we, in future, should think about, can we add more on this, like the company side of demonstrating what they've got as they come forward to allow us to have not 24,000 offers, but a significantly smaller proportion of good offers. So I think that's there.
Isn't it difficult to set the bar? Because you might set it, how long have you been in business? You might set it, what's the nature of your business? But there again, you don't necessarily just want people who can produce PPE, because there could be people who could adapt.
And so
how do you set the bar?
You've absolutely gone to the heart of the problem. I think we could look more at what volumes they could provide in speed. And I think this is a difficult thing to do, because for exactly as you say, you don't want to rule out people that actually, whilst at first sight don't look like they might be applied for PPE, their business. We had I think people who worked in waste. Obviously they use PPE as well. It ends up being the same stuff. So actually, you might not have looked at those if you looked at healthcare providers. So you do need some width, but I think we could do a better job of limiting. Final bit, for one last one.
Yes, go.
I think as we went through this process, we spent more time trying to get upstream and get into the manufacturers directly, and that we had success as we go through the months. Again, I think if you're in this position again, you'd want to have better relationships with the manufacturers. Let's face it, the real challenge is, can you get into their manufacturing slots quickly and ahead of other people? Prior to the pandemic, almost all of our business in PPE was done through wholesalers. The market was simply a commodity market, bought cheaply through people who, through intermediaries. I think that was severely challenged in the pandemic. And a future model where you've got a clearer view of your supply chain from your intermediary right the way back to the manufacturer, I think will be helpful in understanding where you might be able to get more supplies.
Can I pick up on two of the points which you've just made? One of which is about the effect of the call to arms on the PPE cell. Do you have any reflections to offer on the call to arms? Do you think it was a good idea or a bad idea?
So I think I have broadly three reflections. So one, people came forward in that call to arms, and through, I think it was the Coronavirus Business Support website, I think was the formal title. People came forward that we would not have reached out to, and we secured PPE for them. So there was definitely an upside. The downside is the conversation we've just been having. Lots of people came forward, and then it was lots of work for trying to triage which of those were credible, even if they were unusual, and which of them actually there was nothing here for us. So I think that was the challenge. And the third reflection is, before that website went live, we were already getting unsolicited offers of people who could provide us with PPE. It was not, everybody knew we had a problem. It was in the newspapers every day. The politicians were highly concerned about how we were going to fix it. It was at the top of the nation's list of challenges. So I think the scheme at least provided a way of bringing that together. I do think if we were going to reflect on lessons, then thinking about was the gateway into the scheme, if you like, too widely drawn, I think is the thing I'll come back to.
And secondly, in relation to manufacturers, we will hear evidence next week and the week after about the strategy of the UK Make team, which found and selected 24 or so domestic manufacturers and approached them to procure and supply PPE for the UK. The approach of the PPE cell and the new suppliers team was, by contrast, quite different. As you say, it threw the doors open to any offers that were coming in. Was there a reason as to why the PPE cell did not actively go out to seek manufacturers and to try and get down to the bottom of the supply chain? And just to follow on from that, The reason for asking the question is because the more intermediaries there are in the supply chain, the higher the price of the goods become. And so if you can get closer to the manufacturer, that would be a better approach. So rather than sitting, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but waiting for the offers to come to you, to proactively go out to find the manufacturers at the bottom of many of these supply chains.
Yes, so, look, I absolutely agree with the premise, and I think we were trying to do that. So we went back, as we described the different buy teams in the PPE cell. The first one was the thing we called China Buy. This was essentially working with the Foreign Office and the embassy in Beijing, who were working to get as close to the Chinese manufacturers as possible. So that was a very proactive, we knew that's where the action was, and can we use the contacts of the embassy to do the best possible job there. So I think that is following the strategy that you set out. Obviously, we continue to use the SCCL networks and their contracts. So where we had existing relationships with people, we were
So
pushing
pause for a moment. The SCCL networks were those suppliers who were, prior to the pandemic, were supplying into SCCL and then onto the NHS.
Yes. They may have been providing to the NHS as well, but they certainly had contracts with SCCL. Actually, again, I think largely they would have been intermediaries. That's just the way this business worked, but we pushed doors. The coronavirus business support scheme, that call allowing people to come in, I think we chose largely because we knew that our existing networks weren't delivering enough, and we needed to find the unusual. And given this is a market that's full of intermediaries in its normal business, then it felt like it could be appropriate. We've talked about the downsides. UK Make, I think the UK Make team talked to over 500 firms in terms of identifying possibilities. Now, I think, as you say, I think about 25 actually became contracts to deliver PPE manufactured in the UK.
Thank you. My lady, I wonder if that's a convenient moment.
Yes, of course, certainly. I shall return at 3:30. We shall definitely finish you today, Mr. Wood.
Thank you.
Mr. Sharma.
Mr. Maron, the high priority lane, please. I wonder if we could bring up your witness statement again, 528391, and the bottom of page 101, paragraph 382. There you say that in progressing offers within the parallel supply chain, the same guidance, criteria to assess suitability, process maps, which we've covered, due diligence, technical assurance, and financial controls were used, regardless of which team handled the potential contract, including the high priority lane. Does that reflect your experience when you were in the PPE cell?
Yes. I mean, I think the very first stage we know is slightly different. The high priority lane wouldn't wait for a company to fill in a form, but would ring the company. In a non-high priority lane, the form would be filled in first. That would be the first point of contact, and then the company would be rang. So I think apart from that very small difference at the very first stage of stage one on the 8-stage process map, we then followed exactly the same process.
Did you ever hear of incidents in which contracts and offers that were being progressed through the PPE cell were not following what you've set out in paragraph 382?
We certainly had some unusual processes came up, but it wasn't that we deviated from these steps. The one that's in my personal witness statement that we had an unusual process. The counterparty in that case actually bought the PPE themselves and put it on a plane. So we agreed to pay for that after it arrived once we checked it. So I think there were some times when that's something, but that's the only one that comes to mind.
I wonder if we could bring up, please, INQ 000 551 580. This is from the document that we looked at earlier. The initial data triage criteria. This says data triage criteria are reviewed and updated weekly. At publication, efforts have been prioritised as follows. And then it says a product will be marked as high priority if A and B or C are true. And then under A and B, it lists factors that you've described are relevant to the triaging process: company size, the volumes of the offers. And if you take it down to the bottom, and then at C, it says if a donation or VIP, this is also captured by the VIP and donation flags in the system as well. And so what this seems to suggest, Mr. Marin, is that a product will be marked as high priority if A and B, so the company size and the volumes they're offering, are true, or if C is true, if it's a VIP offer, it went straight through. Could you help me with that, please?
Well, my understanding is certainly that in these initial triage stages, we were looking at whether the products were the ones that we thought were a priority. They did change. You know, gowns at the early stages, FP3 Max later. And my understanding was that we were then applying those in a consistent way. And certainly, as we get past this triage stage, all of these offers move to well, the rest of the 8-stage process we talked about: financial due diligence, commercial due diligence, and then closing, when I think the same processes were used and the same tests across those. So that's what I...
Why would it be that if a donation is marked as a VIP, that it therefore wouldn't be required in the triage process to have criteria A and B attached to it? What is it about being a VIP offer that means that at that initial triage stage, it doesn't have to fulfill the requirements of being a company size of greater than 250 employees, or being able to offer a certain quantity of PPE? What is it that's particular and unique about a VIP in C that means that that criteria is overridden?
Yes, so my understanding at the time of these that essentially the VIP lane, or the HPL lane as it's sometimes called, was essentially a handling process. It was put in place, it really evolved to allow us certainty that contracts that had become to the attention of ministers and others, a certainty that they were being followed up. The problem we faced was, given the significant shortage of PPE, there was real concern that offers that were coming that may not be followed up and actually could have been the ones that solved the problem. There was lots of attention from ministers and others around, are you doing the right thing? Is this being advanced? The VIP lane was our response to being able to identify those and have an easy way that allowed us to say, yes, that's been progressed, without having to ask every single member of the team whether a particular contract had gone. So we were trying to limit the number of people that were involved in that. That is what I understood the process to be. Whether then, as this developed, further things were added, this might suggest.
I take what you're saying about the contact with people with a VIP connection, but this is not about contact, is it? This document sets out, not are you being chased by a VIP referrer, but if you are a VIP, you've come in via a VIP, there is criteria here which you do not have to obey in order to be moved on within the 8-stage process that you've just described, for which you have said that it's there to stop the bad offers from being progressed. And yet in this document, it suggests actually that some of the criteria can be set aside, at least at the initial stage, if you have a connection which is a VIP.
So I do think that we need to look at the first 3 stages, which really are together deciding whether we should prioritise a particular deal. I think that my memory is that high priority, I think over 7,000 offers were marked as high priority. So this is not a fast track through to a contract. There's a significant volume of our offers put this. So it is that very first stage of the triage.
What, may I ask, was the difference between the treatment of an offer that was marked as a VIP offer and that was treated by the rapid response team?
So I think the rapid response, well, again, so these are my understandings, that I did not run these processes or indeed take any of these decisions. You have witnesses coming that were intimately involved and will be able to answer. My understanding is the rapid response team was developed to speed up the offers that came through this initial triage and looked the most promising.
And they would be sped up, wouldn't they, on the basis of objective criteria about what the content offered?
My understanding is the rapid response team was looking at the highest volumes offered on the products that we most needed, independent of where the source had come from.
And by contrast, the donation or connection to a VIP is not part of that objective criteria, and yet it does still have an advantage.
So again, this is the initial data triage. The prioritisation is next. I thought we were using consistent terms over the prioritisation.
All right.
I mean, the fact is that basically if somebody was put into the process by the VIP lane, they were passing base 1, weren't they? They weren't being subject to the initial triage. Simple as that, isn't it? Whether or not you approve of it now,
Yes.
whether or not it was your idea, isn't that what was happening? It may have been ministerial management. I suspect that's partly to do with it, but that's the effect, isn't it?
Well, look, I think... so I do think that when we were trying to set this up, that we were trying to make reasoned decisions about how do we quickly move on and manage... try to find the right word. Some people said noise. I don't want to use the word noise. No, there was legitimate interest in... So we needed to manage that. I think as we look back on how we did this, we didn't do it in a good way at all. I mean, frankly, we reviewed it several times. The boardroom review said this wasn't the right thing to do. And frankly, if we'd had a better process in terms of triaging the offers, as we talked about for the break, we probably wouldn't have needed this. I think that's a very valid observation. We've been tested in the High Court on this particular process, actually. Here, the unfairness in this very first stage was found to be unlawful, although actually Justice Farrell generally found that actually we would have awarded, she thought the contract would have been awarded. Yeah. So I think we were trying to do reasonable things at the time whilst trying to do everything else. I would not do this again. And whilst I think it's hard to show that there was a particular beneficial effect. I mean, we may come back to some of the data. I know that Chris Hall has tried to do analysis on the data about whether it sped things up. I think that's an interesting question. I genuinely don't know. But I certainly, the perception that we gave a channel that some people could go quicker, I think has been extraordinarily damaging to the reputation of the programme. I don't think it's reflected well on the public confidence in what we did, and it would have been better that we hadn't done it, undoubtedly. We would have had to find a different way to manage those expectations. Again, if this had been something that we had a run-up to and we'd thought about, I'm absolutely sure we wouldn't have come up with this answer. But in the moment of, bloody hell, what do I do with this? I think, we started to pass things to individual workers. They were also being worked on things that we thought were high priority. The two things got a bit merged. I think this evolves as opposed to any deliberate attempt to set up a channel. And then clearly we have been talking about it ever since in a way that I think has been deeply unhelpful. We certainly didn't intend to give an advantage to people who came through this way. We intended to try and find a way of handling what we thought were both legitimate concerns and things which would get in the way of our teams doing the work. And as we talked about for the break, it was a complicated task to get this done. Getting distractions removed from people was actually a helpful thing. But in retrospect, not
You
the right
mentioned
thing.
there, Mr. Ryan, don't worry, and I'm sorry we've had to press you, but it is important, as you know, to a number of people. You mentioned there about had we thought about it before. Basically, we're going back to the contents of my Module 1 report, planning and preparedness.
Yes.
What work is being done in the department on making sure that a mistake like this, and plainly it was a mistake, everyone seems to agree that now, that mistakes like this don't occur next time round?
So I think it comes back to some of the things we were talking about for the break. The first bit is we are building the resilience of SCCL so that it has a clearer role in the future and has the capacity to build on. I think part of our challenge here was we built a new process live with new people that hadn't been part of this business before. Actually, we should just remember we did that while they're in their bedrooms. You know, this is the week of lockdown, this all happens. We were on Skype in the Department of Health at that time. I don't know whether people remember Skype, but that wasn't easy either. Once you had about 10 people on the call, it fell off. So the first thing, better resilience in our structures. The second, I think we've learned lessons around how do you structure these sort of processes, which would reduce the need, as Boardman set out in his review, for this kind of checking it's all right, because it's clearly being managed in a way that's moving things quickly. So I think going faster in your core process is very important. And then I think really it's just really clear you can't do this in your procurement process. So I mean I think Gareth Rhys-Williams yesterday was talking about, you know, if you ever did have to do this, having a separate administrative function that would look at it and just keep it totally clean from the procurement, if you had to, would be helpful and better than the sense we've got of having a different process. Now I mean the charts say what the charts say, so I'm sure that's there. At the time, it was described to me as basically that first bit of triage that got you from either web form or email in to this is something worth pursuing was slightly different. But after that, commercial assurance, technical assurance was essentially exactly the same process. So we took confidence from that, and indeed the fact that the PPE cell itself and the buy teams made no decisions on whether to award a contract. You know, they made recommendations. The accounting officer of the Department of Health, who had been wholly separate from this process, made the final decision. So that also gave us some assurance that actually our process was justifiable and fair. But, I mean, it's impossible, in retrospect, to say that this was the...
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Marron. And we'll be hearing from Mr. Young during the course of these hearings. Another subject, please. Could we have up INQ 000575086? This is the DHSC schedule. One of the topics or themes which has been running through this module so far is that of data. The inquiry requested DHSC to provide it with contract data in respect of the PPE cell. Mr. Marron, are you all right? Would you like?
I'm all right. Yeah, I've just seen the table you're bringing up, which I know is a very complicated table.
Are you looking at my face, Mr. Ryan? You possibly were.
I will try and take this as quickly as I can. This is a DHSC schedule which sets out the PPE contracts which were entered into by DHSC, in particular in the 100 days which this inquiry is focusing on in this module. Each of the contracts is given an original offer number, which is the box on the top left. There's the offer date. They're then allocated a reference number. Then the contract and supplier name, which are usually the same. Moving across, the company status, the date on which the contract was signed, the contract start date, the type of PPE to which it relates. Sections have been redacted which are irrelevant. We keep scrolling across. The original contract value, the current contract value, and as I understand it, that's what's happened in the event there's been an issue with the contract, and so the value of the contract's been reduced.
Yes.
The supply chain, the work stream through which it came through, which we've already touched upon, UK make, China buy or new buy. The vexed issue of the high priority lane, whether it came in through the high priority lane. If so, what was the source of the referral? And then the actual referrer being the person that actually took it into the system, as it were. And if we keep moving across, the AO, the accounting officer decision maker, Chris Young and John Fundry. We'll be hearing from Chris Young during the course of this module. Whether the contract was awarded directly to the manufacturer, conflict of interest declarations, standard terms and conditions used. If we keep going across. Modern day slavery clauses, prepayment made, percentage of prepayment, and so on and so forth. An enormous quantity of data is represented in this schedule. In respect, if I may, of some of the contracts which are the subject of the thematic reviews or case studies, if we can have a look, please, at row 18, IANDA, one that we'll be coming on to tomorrow. If we just scroll across, it will be seen that in that redacted column, current contract value is unredacted because it's a thematic review, and we'll be considering the detail of that contract, for example, tomorrow with Mr. Blackburn, who's referred to there as the actual referrer. Mr. Maron, this schedule has been produced for the inquiry by the Department for Health and Social Care. As I say, it contains a vast quantity of data and information. The only way in which we can understand that is by way of graphics that the inquiry has put together. It's based on the data contained in this schedule, and I just want to take you to some of those, if I may. The first one is INQ 000 565 970. And page 16. Although this, the schedule we've looked at does contain an enormous amount of data, there are contracts for which some data has not been provided. Could you help us, please, with why that is?
Yes, so clearly this has been an enormous task, and we've worked closely with the inquiry to ensure we do as much as we can. We have found it's been prepared by the Department of Health and Social Care, so it's been prepared off sources that are available to the Department of Health and Social Care in the time available. So we have been able to look at our own contract management database, Atimis. As I think the inquiry may be aware, Atimis was not in place at the time that we did this work. It was all stored, in the very, very early stages on Excel spreadsheets, and then very quickly in April moving on to a dedicated database called Mendix, which is owned by the Cabinet Office. So one thing we have not done is search Mendix. I mean, I think it may be a helpful thing if the Department of Health and the Cabinet Office were to cooperate on trying to fill in the blanks from their data.
One of the problems that you have is that your information is stored in different places. So it's stored in some cases on Excel, on Mendix, and on Atimis.
Yes.
You're not sure as to which of those systems has got the relevant data, or whether you have access to it.
I think the reality is that in this 100-day period, the data was stored on Mendix. And if you think about the PPE cell, which we talked about earlier, essentially this was a DHSC-governed team that drew together people from lots of different organisations. The Cabinet Office, with their lead role in the Government Commercial Service, provided a core of those commercial experts, and they provided the Mendix system from the Cabinet Office. At the time, we, of course, had full access to Mendix as we were working as one team. As we have prepared for this, we have access to the Department of Health's corporate records, but we have not been asked to cooperate with the Cabinet Office on theirs. We've been treated as separate organisations. I think we could work with the Cabinet Office to try and fill this in, but that would be a next step.
All right. Well, for the data which is missing for now from that schedule, You've got the statistics there for each of those categories for conflicts of interest as to whether they were declared. The number of contracts to which it relates is 150. I think there are 394 contracts on the schedule, and that represents 40% of the total. Whether a modern slavery clause was included, that affects 131 contracts, and so on and so forth. I wonder, please, if we could turn to page 12 of this schedule. This is a representation of the contracts for which prepayment was made. And prepayment was made on 256 contracts, which is represented there on the bottom right-hand corner, representing 68% of the contracts by number. I wonder, please, if we could turn to page 14.
Could I comment on this?
Of course.
So I just think this really illustrates the position that we faced. I mean, prepayment just doesn't normally happen, right? It's not what government does. You know, we're a reputable buyer. Everybody knows we're going to pay our bills. You don't have to prepay. In this period, in the PPE market, everybody prepaid. And if you weren't prepared to make a payment up front, you simply didn't access the PPE. It was absolutely a seller's market. As you know, the sales are concentrated, manufacturing concentrated in a very small number of countries, and everybody was competing for it. So I think if we're looking at an example of just how extraordinary a period it was, this brings it home, that you simply couldn't do the deal unless you were prepared to take these very unusual circumstances. And I think we've been clear in our evidence that in order to do business in this period, we really had to take a completely different risk appetite. We accepted doing business with firms that, frankly, I don't think we would normally go anywhere near. We put pre-contract terms that we wouldn't normally accept, and we paid prices that outside of a pandemic would not be acceptable. But that was needed in order to get the PPE that was required for the country. And I think the government was very clear in its instructions to us that we were to go out and secure that PPE. And I think, you know, it's a period in procurement that, well, I mean, I'm not a procurement expert, but I've certainly seen nothing like it in my 30 years in government. And it just, I think, shows the efforts that we went to in order to secure PPE from a position in March where we were very, very worried about supply to a point in June or July where actually I don't think we worried about PPE again over the course of the pandemic.
You've referred to the contract terms. Could we turn, please, to page 14 of this schedule? Again, all of this derived from the, or this chart, I mean, all of it derived from the DHSC schedule that we've looked at to summarise the content of it. You referred to government, standard government terms and conditions. So although prepayment was unusual during the course of the pandemic, it says here that 67% of the contracts that were signed by number, 252 contracts in total, still had standard terms and conditions.
Yes, I think this reflects a set of standards and conditions that the Department of Health and Social Care used, and a slightly different set from the Foreign Office. So, you know, but we were getting largely a set of standard contracts. I think this is our standard terms and conditions in the pandemic. I'm not sure it's a non-pandemic standard terms of conditions, if you see what I mean.
But nonetheless, the parties on the other side of the contracts, for 67% of the cases, were prepared to contract with the government on the terms which it had already, for want of a better word, dictated to them. These are the terms that we would like to contract with you on. You're prepared to agree with those, and that's 252 contracts. Is that right?
Yes. Now, of course, this includes contracts with the prepayment. So this is not a. So just for clarity, this is not. If you were thinking about what a normal government contract would look like, I don't think it's that. This is. We had a standard set of terms that we were trying to use in these procurements, and for most, well, for 67%, that was a success.
Yeah. Yes, of course. So in each of these charts, the data has been isolated to one of those columns.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's the contract with standard terms and conditions. The number of contracts it affects is there on the left, 252, and then those for the others are beneath, and then the percentage is set out in the chart itself.
Yes.
And you're quite right, it doesn't affect at all what the prepayment conditions were.
Yeah.
All right. Page 18, please. One of the columns in the chart is headed contracts which had performance issues. And so the purpose of looking at this is to consider whether contracts which were in the high priority lane compared to contracts which were not in the high priority lane had performance issues. And so that's been filtered out. The high priority lane contracts are 115 at the top. The non-high priority lane contracts are 259 at the bottom. For 3% of the high priority lane contracts, the contract was terminated. For 43%, there was no contractual performance issue. And for 55%, there was a contractual performance issue. Now, by contrast, for contracts which were not in the high priority lane, the important figure is that which is on the right. 39% had a contractual performance issue. And so, at least according to the data in the DHSC schedule, which this chart interprets, high priority lane contracts, 55% of them had a performance issue, and non-high priority lane contracts, only 39% of them had an issue.
So
Is there anything you would
yes.
like to comment on about that?
So I think we talked about contractual performance earlier in the session.
Yes.
So this data, I think you've taken the column of contractual performance issues, yes or no, which I think from memory is 165 or 175 contracts in total. As we went through earlier, a substantial proportion of those contracts in the end turned out not to have a performance issue. So I think what we've got here is you've essentially got everything that came into do not supply that we may or may not have been worried about it. I think the total numbers of contracts, so starting with 176 as the total numbers that had an issue, if we take away those that were released, that were bought to contract, I think we're left with 40 contracts. So I think actually it's those 40 contracts that we should look at if we want to look at is there a difference on performance between the high priority lane and the normal.
Could I just ask you this question then? If we were to take a snapshot in time of the 100 days or thereabouts that we were considering earlier, if you were the Department of Health and Social Care, looking at the contracts within the 100 days or close to those...
I wouldn't know. So you have to remember how this worked. We were buying contracts in those 100 days. That's when we were placing our orders. Our due diligence was on documentation, faxed, emailed, whatever it could be. Until the material arrived in country, we weren't sure. I mean, frankly, we were very worried that significant volumes of it when it arrived in country wasn't going to be up to standard. And that is one of the reasons that the buying is higher than it turns out to be necessary. So the actual point at which we understand there may be a problem is when it arrives. Clearly, it doesn't all arrive in those 3 months. In fact, very large proportions of it start to arrive in September and October and November of that year. So I think the reality is, as the material comes in, we start to understand whether it's clearly fine, straight to the NHS and released. Actually, we're not so sure, off to do not supply, and then a resolution process in our warehouses about whether that works. Some of those things were resolved very quickly. You know, further checks, we're quite happy that this is actually what it says it is, it can be used. Other elements have taken longer, you've gone back to manufacturers. So I think it's not a question of, at a point in time you knew. If you really want to look at, did the contract perform to contract standards, we have to follow this process through to the end. I know it's highly unusual to take that long to get to, did your contract work? But this is a function of the way the PPE arrives, and it arrives during a pandemic. So our focus in November, December of 2020 is making sure we are getting the things that we are absolutely convinced are good to our warehouses in Daventry that are then distributed to the NHS. And we prioritise that over checking the things that we thought might not be.
But to follow your point, if I may, to its logical conclusion, that would mean, based on what you've said, that in the fullness of time, in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more years, it would be possible for the contractual performance issue, if the number of contracts simply to disappear, because over time. Am I wrong? Please tell me.
That is not what I'm saying. So I think we have a clear number, I think it's around 40 of contracts that we have identified as failing to perform against the expectations. We have a dissolution team in place that is pursuing all of those contracts. Some as you've seen from some of the exhibits earlier, we have already reached agreements on. Some we are proceeding to court cases to try and recover our money, and in others we're still in negotiation with the firms themselves over whether to. So that is an active recovery process, but it is on 40 contracts, not 175 contracts, because actually as we work through the 175, lots of them, the problem was not a contractual one. It was we were unsure about the documentation, which turns out to be fine. We've bought ear-looped FP2 masks. When you've signed a contract for FP2 masks, it's not a contractual failure. They're just not the right product. So I think it's 40 contracts that we're really worried about, not 175.
And
these numbers are 175.
Is what you're saying there, is that true in respect of high priority lane contracts and non-high priority lane contracts?
Yes. It made absolutely no difference from the point of ordering and coming through. We have basically carried out the same due diligence ahead of buying and the same caution on arrival in country. I mean, it was, well, you can imagine that we are buying this very, very important kit that people's lives depend on without being able to have it properly tested in advance. You know, we were obviously cautious about the way it came through the department's warehouses. And the other reflection, as you've already commented, we had more PPE arriving than we needed. Essentially, that allowed us to push the good stuff out to the NHS quickly. But back to this.
Just to be clear on this one point, the point you're making would affect this chart of high priority lane contracts and non-high priority lane contracts. Is that right?
Yes.
It's not just in respect of one category.
It's not just in respect of one category.
Right.
I think there are. I'm sorry, I'm now reading my briefing, so this is always a bit. I think there are 21 contracts from the high priority lane that are in our dissolution team, and I think there are 19 from the others. So it is a higher proportion, I think, but I don't think it's quite the same as the graph you've got here. I'm very happy to share those numbers if it's helpful. I think they are in the table, but that table is very difficult to understand, so if it would be helpful to provide a breakdown, we can do.
We'll be grateful. Thank you, Mr. Maron. The next chart to look at, please, is that on page 24. So the question which is answered in this chart are whether contracts were awarded to the manufacturer, and comparing whether the contracts awarded were in the high priority lane or not in the high priority lane. And the key figure from this chart is that in the high priority lane, 79% of contracts were not awarded to a manufacturer, i.e. they're awarded to an intermediary, whereas in the non-high priority lane, only 47% of contracts were awarded to a manufacturer. And so what that means is that in the high priority lane, there are more intermediaries that are being awarded contracts than there are compared to non-high priority lane contracts. Is that right?
Yes, and I think that's what I expect. I mean, the size of the discrepancy I'm not sure on, but if you think about what we were doing, the high priority lane is really part of that first stage in that 8-stage process for new offers. So we've opened up the coronavirus business support scheme. We're asking people to come forward who might be able to find PPE. This includes all of the unusual providers who are intermediaries largely and have contacts. We are trying to get their PPE into the country using those networks. So I think that is unsurprising. If you think about some of the other lanes, UK make, China buy, we are there going to manufacturers deliberately. So I think this is what I'd expect. So if you took...
So forgive me, you would expect that contracts in the high priority lane were more likely to be awarded to intermediaries?
I expect the whole of the new suppliers lane to be more likely to go to intermediaries. And I think the HPL was largely there. Now, I know that we have marked some China buy and some UK make as HPL. I think those two teams worked completely separately. So I think what we've really done there is marked that the HPL team had an initial email and they've passed it on. My understanding, which would be worth testing with the teams, is that the UK make process and the China buy process ran essentially independently of the new supplier team.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but if an intermediary is involved in the supply chain, doesn't that make the prices which are being paid for the goods higher, and therefore that contracts which are being awarded in the high priority lane, because there is a preponderance of intermediaries within them, will therefore have a higher contract price. Or am I wrong about that?
Well, I think the key thing was that, manufacturers or intermediaries, people who had access to PPE for immediate delivery in this period were demanding much higher prices. They were often intermediaries. The challenge in the market was, do you accept to pay those prices with those intermediaries, or do you not buy? So I think we were in a position that we were buying from intermediaries at high prices. But that was the necessary step to secure immediate supplies of PPE. This is, I think, I understand, and again, you will ask the commercial experts, that much of the buying in normal times is through intermediaries in this market. So it's not something where, we've had direct relationships with manufacturers. Gloves, masks, these are not complicated products. They were sold as commodities on lowest price. So I do think that initial response where we need to get it quickly, we looked at as many people as possible, and we had to look at intermediaries. You will see, I think you have an exhibit on dates and how it moves. I think over the course of this period, as we get better at reaching out to the Chinese manufacturers, understanding our supply chain better, bringing on UK make, we proportionally shift to manufacturers. I think there's high value in shifting to manufacturers if you can do it. Your points of, you delay us, so that's some cost coming out. I think you've also got more security, more confidence. So I would agree the premise that the more you can move up the supply chain, the better. But in the moment facing we haven't got enough PPE, I think we were right to look at the intermediaries, and we were right to buy the prices.
The final chart, if I may, page 32. This is looking at the average unit cost of PPE items by work stream. This comes with the caveat, if I may put it in these terms, that a number of contracts in the schedule refer to multiple categories of PPE. Those have had to be stripped away because it's not possible to separate out the different pricing. So, for example, if a contract had gowns and gloves, there is a single contract price. One cannot understand from the data which has been provided which proportion of the contract is for gowns and which proportion of the contract is for gloves. And so this chart on price relates only to those contracts which have a single type of PPE on them. Gowns, eye protection, face masks and gloves. And it's been separated out into the 3 lanes of supply. And what is apparent from this chart is that for gowns, the most expensive route of supply is new buy. For eye protection, the most expensive route of supply is UK make. For face masks, it is also UK make. But consistently, and for gloves, UK make doesn't appear, but consistently, the cheapest place from which to procure PPE is the China buy lane.
Yes, so I think there are quite a few caveats about this data. So the one that you mentioned, which we may be able to help if we had enough time to look at and break it up. But I think the other big thing, right, there were 2 things that really drove price. The first one was delivery and when you wanted it. If you wanted it immediately, it was far more expensive. So I think if we looked at breaking down when these things were delivered, you would see that gowns, eye protection, face masks to be delivered in March, April, May would have had a significant premium compared to taking something in September, October, November, or indeed into the next year. So that's one thing. So I think we would really, if we want to do a proper price analysis, we would need to look over time and when the delivery started. And I think the second one we would really look at is volumes. And again, this is from memory, so I may not be quite correct, but I remember very significant volume contracts being placed in China buy. And so it may be that we were buying large quantities, which brings your price down. Now, I think that takes you back to actually, I think the premise that you're pushing, that if we're able to buy in large quantities from manufacturers, we should get better prices. I think that is correct. But again, in a position where we felt we were critically short, we had to look at other options, and indeed we accepted that we would pay higher prices in order to secure the PPE that we needed.
Now, of course, this analysis has been conducted by the inquiry on the basis of the DHSC schedule, which we've referred to. One of the themes that you've mentioned earlier was data, and you referred to automation. And if I may, in my penultimate questions, just ask you, please, about, given your experience in the PPE cell, looking at the process that was established, the experience of those that were working in the PPE cell, and also looking at the importance of data in working out prices and quality of supply and contract performance. What do you think could be done better in the future in the event of a pandemic that required emergency procurement when it comes to data?
Yes, so I think in the sort of the basic question of recording, I think we're in a much better position in the Department of Health. The Atomus system, tailor-made system to run procurement and record. So I think that is now in place. I think I'm right in recalling that we'd initially procured that at the autumn perhaps of 2019 to be rolled out for June, July 2020. So it was sort of coming.
So Atomus is one development.
Yes, so I think so if we were doing this now, then all of the material will be stored on Atomus from the beginning. There would be no need to use Excel spreadsheets in the first couple of days, and no need to use the Cabinet Office Mendex document.
And does Atomus allow you to automate and triage the offers that are coming in, or not?
I understand that it's a tailor-made procurement system. One of the procurement experts you're talking to will have a much better view of its capabilities. I am not a procurement expert, but I think in certain the issue of data recording, access, have we got that? I think that would be better and flow. So I think that is definitely an improvement. Then I think in a pandemic, I think the other thing you just have to be prepared for, if we get into a position that we're doing emergency procurement, you really have to be ready to build and pull together all the data you had. So the things that were really important to us.
To pull together all
of the data. So I think I'm just trying to give a sense of the data challenge. So we have talked about pricing and contracts, which is clearly a critical part of this. We were running a price comparison process, looking at the average prices paid over the time and variation, trying to avoid any contracts over 25% higher than the 2-week run rate. That's the sort of thing you have to do in the pandemic. I mean, I don't think you can do that in advance. So you've got to set up those systems that you're monitoring in line. The other bit on data that was, I think, much more challenging was really understanding the usage in our system. We had no frontline data on actual usage of PPE or indeed inventory.
So I think that's what's sometimes described as the burn rate. So the inventory
Yes.
is the quantity which is stored on site in
Yes.
NHS trusts and hospitals and in the care sector, and the burn rate is the speed at which
Yes.
that PPE is being used.
Yes.
And what you're saying is that if you had data on the burn rate, you'd be able to better predict the types and quantities of PPE which you would need to buy.
Better prediction, and at any point where you are running short of supply, better targeting of where it needs to go. I mean, essentially, if somebody's got significant inventory locally, you don't need to send them any more. We simply didn't know that. So, I mean, I know that everybody struggled, but having that sort of information, I think, would be really helpful. And then the other thing that I think, need to be really clear, the military team that helped us with a command cell really helped us build a model to track our incoming supply as well. I think one of the things that perhaps we don't talk about very much is the disruption was not just to the production of PPE and the contract, but actually the global systems for moving these things around also were severely challenged in the pandemic, and so significant work doing that. I do remember, just one last point, if you might, I do remember.
I'm very sorry, but there are a number of questions to be asked by the call participants. Thank you very much for the evidence which you've given, my lady. I don't know if you have any questions or if we can turn to...
No, thank you. Alex, Mr Thomas, first of all.
Good afternoon, Mr. Maron. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Workers. I have 2 short topics, 4 questions. Mr. Maron, I'm sure you're aware that concerns have been raised and were particularly pronounced regarding the fit and suitability of PPE for ethnic minority healthcare workers, correct?
Yes, I'm aware.
Yeah. Now, in terms of inclusivity of the PPE design and procurement, how did the DHSC assess the needs of ethnic minority healthcare workers during the procurement process, and what steps are being taken to address these specific needs in ongoing and future PPE procurement strategies?
Yes, thank you. So I think 2 points are really important here. One, there's a very general point around, for the whole range of PPE, having the right sizes for everybody is really important. Now, I think that is broadly applicable. I think if we looked at some of the challenges we had in providing the right equipment to ethnic minority staff, I think the real challenge came in what we call the FFP3 respirator masks. So for people not familiar, this is the very close-fitting mask that needs to make a seal. Now, obviously, those masks, they don't fit all face shapes and sizes. And I think if we particularly look at the sort of distribution of face shapes and sizes, for some of our ethnic minority colleagues, they found it very hard to get a fit in a mask. We did two things. One, a really significant program of fit testing. Essentially, you have a liquid put in front of the mask. If you can taste it, it doesn't fit. So it's really making sure that for everybody who had a mask, we knew whether it fit or not. And without a fit-tested mask, you couldn't work on aerosol generating procedures. So the highest level of risk wasn't allowed. We became aware of these difficulties, and we moved to try and have a much broader range of masks, simply to give a different range of sizes and fits, so that more people could find a mask that would work for them. At the start of the pandemic, our pandemic stockpile, I think, had 4 different shapes of mask. By the time we got to the end, we'd procured 12 different shapes. So we really made an effort to try and make sure we had a much broader range of PPE that would meet everybody's needs. And I think that was one of our significant learnings.
Let me move on. I've got 3 questions. I want to get through them quickly. What modelling methods were used to predict PPE demands in primary care? And did these models account for the demographic diversity amongst end users, particularly for higher risk groups, including ethnic minority healthcare workers? Or was a one-size-fits-all approach adopted?
No, we didn't have a one-size-fits-all approach. We worked very hard across the whole range of PPE to make the wide range of sizes so that people could find appropriate PPE available. And indeed, as I've talked about the respirator masks, really significant steps to change the range of masks available so that everybody could find something to fit. And indeed, as we made PPE available, we tried to make the widest possible range available, both to our hospitals and later to primary care and social care. And I think our work on the e-portal allowed primary care, so that's GPs, dentists, pharmacists, small social care providers, to order their PPE direct from the department in a wide range of...
Mr. Maron, I don't mean to cut across you, but you're making it sound as if there were no problems, but we've heard in various modules that have preceded this, there was a number of problems with the fit.
I'm sorry if I've given that impression. I do not intend in any way to minimise the challenges. I think I was clear that at the start of the pandemic, we had very few masks and a very wide risk. People found that very difficult to secure fit. We did take steps to try and broaden that. And I think this is one of the things that, as we go forward, ensuring we've got a wider range of masks available in our stockpiles,
right.
so that people have it, I think is very important.
Let me move on to my last topic, and I'll get through this very quickly. So let's, following on from what you've just said, let's turn to transparency and representation in the procurement decision-making. Your witness statement reflects a significant role in these decision-making processes, highlighting the opportunity to engage with various stakeholders, including organisations like whom I represent. So question, can you help her ladyship with this? What key lessons were learned regarding the procurement and distribution of PPE during the pandemic, and how are these lessons being incorporated into future emergency preparedness policies to better serve diverse healthcare populations?
So I think the key lessons we've taken, one, making sure that we've got a stockpile of PPE available that allows us to respond. We're holding a much wider range of products than we did before. I think we have learnt that lesson. Again, I think the specific challenge for ethnic minority staff was in the respirator masks. We have built a wider range of masks which should fit far greater range of face sizes. We also, indeed only in small amounts, provided small amounts of powered hoods that could be used instead of masks. These are particularly important for people who have beards and are not able to remove the beard for their religious or other reasons. So there was experimentation in how we could make sure that people could take this forward. And I think as we think about our pandemic preparedness for a future event, ensuring that we have those things in place is important. I think the other thing, it's not quite the same issue, but I think it's really important. I think we could do a much better job of communication. I felt that many times there was real concern and fear amongst staff, and particularly ethnic minority staff, about what they were asked to do. And I think the changes in the guidance, I think, were very difficult. And I remember the BMA being involved in a judicial review against our IPC guidance, where the litigants came to see myself and Susan Hopkins of the IPC cell, and we managed to work through that. Actually, they felt that our guidance was sensible, but they simply hadn't understood it. I think our communication could be much better.
Communication. Finally, this. How are you going to ensure going forward that groups like the one that I represent, FEMHO, and similar organisations are represented and involved in the procurement decision-making processes?
I think we're very open to having a broader conversation about procurement. I'm very happy to talk to you about how we might do that. And I think the department has really sort of taken on the need to really think through how we run our procurement and our pandemic preparedness so that we're ready to meet the needs of all of our community. And I think we generally believe that we could have done more earlier in the COVID-19 pandemic. And
that's very fair of you. Thank you. Thank you, milady.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Ms. Campbell. Ms. Campbell's just there.
Thank you, Mr. Marin. I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved. Two topics, please. And can I say at the outset, if you're not the right person to answer my questions, it's important that you say so, because I appreciate you've given a corporate statement, yes, and these may not be within your direct expertise or experience. The first question is about supply routes to community providers, and we looked briefly when you were being asked questions earlier at a chart, I think it's on page 205 of your statement, in which on the right-hand side we can see how distribution to community providers was to be organised. And the background to the question is the commitment by the government to provide PPE free of charge, including to, if you like, health and social care providers in the community, GPs, dentistry, pharmacies, yes, even prisons. Okay. And in your statement, it's actually at paragraph 636 for the record, you go on to explain that there were two main routes of supply. One was via commercial wholesalers, and the other was via local authorities, local resilience forums. And just to give it some context, the commercial wholesalers received about 337 million items, and about 637 million items went through the LRFs, all right? Am I right that the obvious difference between the two routes is that the local resilience forums would distribute PPE from their hubs for free, whereas the commercial wholesalers would distribute PPE or make it available to be purchased, having bought it or acquired it from the DHSC or another source?
Yes, so I can answer for England. I know what we did in England.
Yes.
I should break this down. So before the pandemic struck, the plan to supply social care and the sort of small primary care providers was that they would continue, as they had in normal circumstances, to buy from wholesalers.
Yes.
And the department would release stock from the PIP stockpile and others to those wholesalers, so that could continue.
Yes.
I think whilst we did release, well, you have the numbers. We did try this, and it had some. We were concerned very early in the pandemic that this route was not sufficient. The local resilience forums, which I think we started at the very beginning of April, but I would need to check the exact date, was our first response to how do we get more PPE to social care, primary care, all of the small providers that you can't take a huge pallet and drop it on their doorstep like a kind of hospital. The LRF, so that's Local Resilience Forum, we definitely saw that as an emergency channel, that we were trying to do that as a top-up so that the people in most need could get it. We never saw that as a continuous way of doing this, so, and you see that by the time we get to June and July of 2020, we have small providers for primary care, social care providers, and indeed all providers by the time we get to the autumn, registered on what we called the e-portal, which essentially was an ordering system.
I really don't want to go as far as the e-portal. I think that kicks in about September, as you say, or
I think by June that we've got small providers basically registered.
My question is slightly different. When you use the commercial wholesalers, which was a significant source of supply, if not the primary one, to what extent was it considered that commercial suppliers would sell PPE to community providers for profit and therefore was inconsistent with the government commitment to providing it for free?
So I think, so this is my understanding, so I've checked this in advance. I think my memory is that the process intended that we would sell providers, we sell to the government sell to wholesalers at a normal PPE price, and they would sell it on at that price. So, or, maybe with a small margin. It certainly wasn't the idea that they would sell it on at the pandemic prices, which, as we've talked about, were significantly high. So I think it was not a role of free PPE at that time. We moved away from that very quickly to providing free emergency PPE from the LRFs, and then, of course, by the time we get to the summer, we are providing free PPE to everybody.
I think we'll leave it there and pick it up with another witness next week, because I want to ask you also about the Four Nations distribution of PPE. And you address it in your statement over a fairly lengthy section that culminates with reference to a protocol issued by the Secretary of State for Health on the 1st of March 2021, which essentially indicates that each devolved administration would control its own share of the funding envelope, would share information between them, would seek value for money by minimising competition between the four nations within the international market, and would collaborate in terms of need and resilience. We had invited you, and I hope you've had the opportunity to look at an email exchange between representatives of the Northern Irish, Scottish and Welsh administrations, and for the record, it's INQ 000377395. And in that email exchange, I hope I'll jog your memory, there are concerns about the proposal from the DHSE that it would manage the PPE fund on behalf of all four nations, and the time of this email is mid-May 2020. And those involved in the email were concerned that really it left more questions than it answered, and it certainly didn't answer their concerns about procurement on their behalf. They suggested in that email in May 2020 a new Four Nations PPE procurement group, that each administration would be an equal partner, that they would plan future PPE in that group in terms of expenditure, and where the requirements of each nation overlapped, they could work together to get best value. Now, is it fair to observe that there's not a great deal of difference between what was being proposed by the devolved administrations in May 2020 and that which ultimately was in the protocol issued in March 2021?
So I think broad reflections on the work with the devolved administrations.
Well, keep them narrow.
Yeah, very quick. So
we're running out of time, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Ms. Maron, sorry.
Yeah, so we operated separately before the pandemic.
Yes.
As the crisis hit, we worked closely together. There was a proposal that the Department of Health would lead for everybody, and we worked on that basis for a short period of time. We then agreed that actually it was better to devolve the fair share of the resources we were given to each of the nations, and we would all run our own procurement efforts with the coordination you talk about. So that lets everybody's procurement team be part of this and use everybody's networks. So that's where we ended up. And then the other bit I think was really important throughout this period, we were sharing information about our stocks and what we had, and all 4 nations helped the others through mutual aid of, moving masks or gowns, whatever the challenge might be between the 4 nations. So
it might be reasonably inferred from that answer of evolution in terms
Yes,
of arrangement that it would have been significantly more helpful to have a protocol in place pre-pandemic about what 4 nations PPE procurement would look like.
I think the 4 nations worked really closely together. We had a 4 nations PPE board that met between April and August to really try and coordinate. I think the immediate task of ensuring the PPE across the 4 nations was used where it was most needed, I think we did an excellent job of. I think the questions of how to do procurement, we've talked at length the challenges we face setting up a new parallel supply chain. I do think that the position we landed in that allowed us to take advantage of the expertise of procurement in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, as well as the NHS English procurement, I think was a sensible place to end.
And just finally, in terms of that position, is that the position you landed in May 2021 onwards with that protocol coming into play?
I believe it was around that period. I would need to check.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. Ms Mitchell. Ms Mitchell's that way, directly ahead in front of you.
I'm instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. And it's really the flip side of the questions that you were being asked there by my learned friend, Ms Campbell. The question that I was going to ask you about was from your perspective, would there have been merit in having one pandemic plan where single procurement and distribution was involved? But in fact, you've answered that question by saying that you thought it was better to devolve. So I suppose the question then is, why was that?
So I think in the position that we faced, it was really helpful to be able to use the experience, skills, networks of all of the procurement teams. I mean, maybe it would be possible to bring all the procurement teams together into one group. We didn't attempt to do that. I think doing that at the point we had lockdown, I think would have been too difficult. So I think in the end, ensuring that everybody was able to bring in supplies was really helpful. We continued to coordinate. We didn't want a position where the English procurement was bidding against the Scottish procurement for the same contract in China. That clearly would be unhelpful. So we continued to coordinate to try and avoid that. But I think we really were in a position where we wanted as much capability and capacity as possible on this task. And I think this allowed us to do that.
So it was just employing as many people who had that skill set as possible and looking at it from all 4 nations.
I think in the immediate period we've been talking today about how did we make this emergency response, I think that was the right thing to do. As we think our resilience going forward, it may be worth considering whether there are other ways of doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. That completes the questions that we have for you, Mr Mayor. I appreciate how hard you and your colleagues must have worked during the pandemic and how distraught I'm sure many of you are. I think you've shown signs of it this afternoon, that all your hard work has been undermined by the creation of the VIP lane. I hope you understand why we had to examine it. But I'm extremely grateful to you and your colleagues for the work that you did and, of course, for the work that you're doing helping the inquiry. I know that you probably have to arrange some of the response to us, and it's a huge burden, I know that. So thank you for that, and thank you for your help this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Very well, I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Otherwise.